Frontline workers keep our world moving. They work in high-stakes, fast-changing environments where technology can empower them or hold them back. And when adoption fails, the impact ripples outward, slowing teams, frustrating customers, and undermining the success of the entire organization. This is Frontline Innovators, and I'm your host, Justin Lake. In each episode, I speak with leaders who are rethinking how technology is introduced, embraced, and sustained on the front line. Leaders putting people at the heart of digital transformation. Frontline Innovators is brought to you by Skillful. We help organizations achieve lasting technology adoption for frontline teams so they can work smarter, safer, and with confidence in the tools they use every day. Okay, welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and I've got another great episode lined up for today. Today's guest is a human-centered transformation leader at a large biopharma company. Her work is all about bringing together systems design, culture, and shared understanding, helping teams build the clarity and connection they need to navigate change. She spent her career creating environments where people, purpose, and community are at the heart of how work gets done. Please welcome the Frontline Innovators, Marin Richeson. Hello.
Hello. Thanks, Justin. Appreciate that intro.
I am so glad you're here. We had a great chat. It's been many months now, it seems. So it's always a little bit strange when our initial introduction and the first actual interview that we have are months apart, but I already feel reconnected with you and so glad to have you on the call today. So I'm going to start off. We've changed things up a little bit in the kind of second run of Frontline Innovators, and we're asking a little bit of a different question to kick things off. And it's really about the business value of change and transformation and all the things that are going inside the companies that we're talking about here in the show. So I want to ask you, what is the biggest operational consequence of poor frontline adoption? Kind of thinking about it in terms of like the business impact when things don't go well. What are your thoughts on that?
And the first thing that comes to mind is just not getting your return on investment, right? So you whatever money you're spending on the enhancements, you're not really getting the return on that if you can't get the people to adopt it.
You know, it's amazing to me. I did a bit of a focus group exercise about a year ago, and I was surprised to see how few leaders talked about the lack of ROI on their digital transformation initiatives. It caught me off guard, actually. I thought, like, going into this, I had such a strong assumption that was going to be the first thing that everybody brought up. And it was actually one of the last on like a stack ranking of things that were important to them. And I think it may have been just the nature. They were really talking more about the other areas of business disruption. And I think it may have been the types of leaders that we had in this group, because they were like the very operational focused leaders who were thinking about kind of keeping the lights on, not necessarily thinking about, did we get an ROI from our Salesforce implementation, right? But that surprised me a little bit. What do you think? Tell me about maybe an experience that you've seen where the ROI has been challenged. I'd like to dig into that a little bit because I think it speaks to really the business impact of the challenges that we talk about here.
Yeah. So there's an initiative happening right now at my company where not enough effort was put into getting the end users on board with the change that was coming, and it's a very large, expensive project, and they're really struggling to get the adoption and to really see, like, you have to get a critical mass of people to actually buy in and start following the new process and using the new tool to really see if it works. And they're struggling to even get that, folks reverting back to their old way of doing the work quietly in the corner, doing it the old way instead of doing it the new way. So, I mean, it's a massive initiative with a huge budget, like multi-million-dollar budget, and they're really struggling without that human buy-in. Yeah.
So let's just get right to what you and I are dying to talk about, which is the people
Yes.
side of all of this transformation. Why do you think that change has such an impact on some of those folks? I mean, I would assume that you're not implementing this technology to make their lives miserable or harder or slower or less effective. So, if the opposite of all of those things is actually true, you're trying to make it faster, easier, more effective for them. Why do you think there's such resistance?
I mean, in this particular initiative that I'm thinking about, the the change in the tool and the way of working, I think it's down to the it's a difference in identity for the worker. So the way they used to identify themselves as a worker and the value that they provide in that role is changing with this new tool and new process. And no one has said to them, like, here is the value you provide in this new role. And like no one has helped them to really step into that future, into this new identity and this new way of providing value. And I think that is, for that particular initiative, I think that is the biggest gap that we have in terms of adoption.
I think that's actually, you may be the first person that's talked about that on the podcast. I actually think that's really insightful because I think what you just described probably has existed a lot, despite that I've not heard it on any of my previous conversations here. So, how do you think we overcome that? If that's true, if there's some question about their value in this newly redefined role, how do we shift their perspective on the incentives and their value to the organization? And how do we unwind some of that, the old ways?
The way we handle any change that we're asking people to make, which is ask them what they need to be successful.
Wait a second. Are you talking about like actually having conversations with the human beings? Is that what
I
you're
am.
saying?
I am. Yes. Yes. And I don't mean like, right before you roll it out. I mean, way at the beginning of the process. Like the company's made this decision to roll out this new technology, this new process. What do you need to be successful? So success is not an option, right? It is what do you need to be successful? But how we get there, that is co-created with the users. Yeah.
So, the organization that you're talking about, thousands or tens of thousands of people, I know it's easy for us to sit in a conversation like this right now and say, hey, we just need to go talk to the people. But do you literally mean talk to everybody, or do you mean just grab samples that are hopefully representative? Like, I want to dig into what seems like it might be obvious because it's not obvious to everyone. It's not even obvious to me when we mean we should talk to each individual person versus when we should talk to the kind of quote unquote people of the population, right? And I think in us, again, if you're talking about three people, then those things are both the same. If you're talking about 10,000 people, having an individual one on one conversation with 10,000 people is probably not scalable. So it sounds nice. And I'm not trying to challenge it as much as I am understand, like, how do we actually make that happen where it's meaningful in a large scale organization?
Yeah. It's a great question. So when it's possible to do 100%, you do 100%. When it's not, I would say you focus in on the folks who are most likely to be your early adopters. So probably there are managers and team leads who know who those people are, right? Who are the people who are the most open minded, the most willing to try something new. And those are the folks that you talk with first, right? You stay away from the folks who are most resistant in the beginning and you put your efforts into the folks who are most likely to adopt. And you ask them, right, for their input, what they know about their teammates, what they know about, how their role works and what they think would be most helpful for them. And then from there you build on out. Right. So you build your plan based on what your early adopters have to say.
Do you have a name for those people? Do you refer to them as super users, or do you have another descriptor, change champions?
I mean, early adopters are most open minded.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
So you said something that I have seen. One thing that I want to just pull on the thread a little bit is you said not necessarily talk to the people that are going to be more resistant. I forget the exact phrase you said, even though it just happened 60 seconds ago. But you were basically referring to those people who are not the early adopters, who will be the late adopters. You think there's you advocated for maybe not including them in that conversation. I wonder if there's an argument to be made that we should solicit some feedback from them to find out what are some of the things that would cause them to be laggards in that scenario. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you don't leave them out of the process, right? Like you're going to have to get them to come along at some point. What I mean is that when you're initially trying to figure out, like, trying to dig in and see like what would really work and not work, what's really going to be valuable and not valuable in terms of making the folks successful in the change, you start with those early adopters. But that doesn't mean that you don't listen to the folks who have resistance. Right? Certainly you give them a voice and you allow them to raise their concerns and you do your best to address those concerns in your messaging. But if you put all of your time and energy into trying to bring the folks who are most resistant along, it's really going to be a lot of hard work. And it's going to take a lot of time and effort where like the rest of the population, you'll have a better chance of getting them to come. And once that social proof, is there with the rest of the early adopters and the sort of neutral folks, when there's a critical mass of those folks who have said like, yes, I'm willing to do this, then the resistors are like, well, I'm more and more on an island by myself and I see my peers are adopting this. So maybe I can too. Right? So it's more like the social proof that you get from that critical mass of folks who have adopted that will bring the resistors along. But that doesn't mean that you ignore them and you don't give them a voice in the process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you have a formal structure framework to pull together those early adopters? Like, okay, so we've got, I'll just make up numbers, but we've got 10,000 people. We identify dozens or a couple hundred people that we think, okay, these have been selected by people that are close in the field that know that these folks are going to be early adopters. What do you do to then communicate with them? Because in most of the time, if you have this many people, they're not all in the same location. So it's not like you can say, hey, everybody, just pop over to the conference room for a minute. I've got coffee and donuts. How do you actually handle that communication with some level of scale and still be effective?
hmm So, I mean, a number of different things come to mind, and it might depend on how many people you have in the role of change adoption. Maybe you can divide and conquer, but you can do phone calls. You can have a survey that they fill out anonymously. You can host focus groups so people can join if they want to be part of a group discussion. So you can have a number of different ways of reaching them depending on who they are and how many there are and how many people you have to divide and conquer, and talk to all of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Do
Right.
you ever struggle with consistency? I can, as I'm thinking about this, I'm painting this picture in my head of the game of telephone where you can start to communicate with some folks, and then by the time the message actually gets all the way out to everyone who needs to hear it, it's morphed a few times. Any tricks that you can share that would help ensure consistency of how we get that message out?
I mean, I guess in this case, I'm thinking about how we getting the message in, right, to
Mhm.
us, as opposed to getting a message out.
Asking questions. Yep. The
Yeah,
the
trying to
feedback
trying to
mechanism.
gather
Yep.
feedback, right. So, I don't really care if it's messy,
Mhm.
gathering the information back because you're gonna distill down what you've gathered and reflect it back and say, "Did I get it right?"
So you look at this as an iterative process. So you're doing surveys, you're having a couple of calls, you're having those conversations, you're gathering feedback, and then you summarize that, turn that back out to the population and say, what are we getting right? What are we missing? Have any surprises ever come up in that process of like something surely has caught you off guard when you've done these surveys? Give me an example or two of something that's come up where you're like, I can't even believe they just called this out.
Do you mean, like, when we reflect it back, or you mean in the initial gathering?
I'm curious about both, but initially, just when you first gather information and you're soliciting feedback and input.
Nothing completely outlandish is coming to mind, but I think what has been most, maybe surprising, and maybe it shouldn't be, in doing this process is when there are patterns, right? When the patterns emerge and you're like, oh, like this is something that is consistent across several people. That's sort of like the most interesting thing that happens. Maybe the one-off things that happen that are a little bit surprise, a little bit outlandish or something like that. Because it's just one-off here and there, it's not that impactful. But when you start to see this pattern emerge in the feedback, that's like to me, that's the most like surprising and insightful and exciting part of it.
So let's go back then to the communication when so you've gathered what percentage of people do you think would qualify in a large population as an early adopter? What do you typically see? I mean, are we just talking single digits here?
Yeah, I don't know, 3 to 5%, something
Yeah.
like that.
Okay. Any way that you can think of that would describe the early adopters that maybe isn't obvious to all of us? I mean,
Hmm.
we think when we're talking about technology, we're thinking about kind of the whiz kid kind of, on the surface. But is that always the case?
I mean, I would consider myself, sort of technology averse, but I would also consider myself an early adopter. So I am open to learning new things. I'm interested in new ways of doing, new ways of being, new ways of thinking, even if I am slow to learn new technology specifically. So I don't think you have to be a super user to be an early adopter. Like it's more someone who has a curious mindset and a willingness to think differently or have a different perspective on something. Like that's the person you want to talk to, and the person who also has like a good rapport with their other team members, even if the team members are not as open minded, right? So like they've got a good relationship with their team members, and they have this sort of natural curiosity. I think that's the people you want to talk to.
I think that's actually really interesting that you talked about the curiosity and kind of their standing in the team. I also you just reminded me of an answer to my own question that I've experienced in the field where I was doing a ride along. I was with a bunch of delivery drivers in the break room, and I got to witness something that most people would have predicted that we'd see the opposite. So this organization, which had young, probably the youngest was like early 30s guys, and then some other guys that had been in the industry for probably 20 or 30 years, and they were, the gray hair guys in the business. And you would have thought it was the young guys who were quicker to grab the technology and be the early adopter. And what I witnessed was that it was actually the opposite. The older guys that had been through 5 iterations of this technology over their 20 years of doing their job were like eye rolling and saying like, "Oh, corporate's making us use yet another new device now," right? But the thing I witnessed with them is they were so comfortable in their role. I didn't have a probe stuck into their brain, so I can't be certain I know what their emotions were, but certainly their outward demeanor was that they were so comfortable in their role that this change was not going to throw them off track. And so even though they were older and maybe what you would typically profile as being like, oh, those are the guys that are going to be reluctant to adopt this newfangled technology stuff, it was completely the opposite in this group. It was the young dudes on that team who were a little bit apprehensive. And what we witnessed, I had a whole team of people that were there when we did this. I think the young guys just weren't as comfortable in their core job. So now when you also take on that they have to absorb additional change in the form of this new handheld, it's not a big deal. It's an Android device, wasn't the end of the world. But to them, it was actually a threat because it was like yet one more thing that they had to absorb.
Mhm.
Any similar things that you've seen
I
in
mean,
different workforces?
that example just makes me think about that whole identity thing that we were just talking about a few minutes ago. So that the older guys were firm in their identity, right? Of like who they are as the worker, what value they provide, and they've lived through enough changes that they know that like the worker is stable, even though the technology and the process may change. Right? The human value remains consistent. That's not exactly what you asked me, but that was just my reflection on
Yeah.
into your example.
Well, getting back to that and just thinking about the way that people think about their role, do you think that maybe sometimes maybe not sometimes, maybe all the time, we're spending too much time thinking about the technology and not enough on the psychology of the people? I mean, I know in the change profession, we already talk a lot about that, but I think the way you've described some of these things already, it kind of takes it to a different level about empathy, but a deeper form of empathy, not just kind of putting yourself in their shoes, but really thinking about the way they are going to think about their value and their role in the future. And I guess you're right. I mean, these things are all kind of converging back on the same point, which is maybe those older guys were just more comfortable in their identity and they knew that this wasn't going to change. In that particular case, I don't think that their identity was actually going to change. So maybe that's actually part of it. As I think back to the way we were talking about this before, you were suggesting that when these changes are happening, they are often going to change the way that a person is valued in their organization. I think actually, as I'm thinking about the point that I was making, in the case with those drivers, they had been through this so many times, they knew there wasn't actually going to be a change, right? That was maybe actually the point that they were trying to convey to their younger counterparts is like, guys, this is just another device, but the job is still the same, man. You got to get in the truck, you got to do the deliveries, you got to do the thing, right? And now you're just going to do it on a blue device instead of a black device or whatever, right? But maybe to those young guys, they thought it was actually going to be more impactful to them. Yeah. So, what do you think? What role does culture in the company play in how we communicate these types of things? I mean, the concept of trust comes up on this podcast all the time because we're talking about people and change and adoption and friction, resistance, and all of these things. And so trust often comes up. But I think trust is one of those things that's easy to talk about when we're talking one on one interactions with people and less easy when we're talking about organizations at scale. And that to me really speaks to, kind of culture at a broader level. So what are your thoughts on what can be done around that or the impact of culture on that, first of all, and then what we can do to support that?
Hmm. I love talking about culture, right? Because I really think like that is the goal, is to create a culture where the folks are open to change, or the culture is transformation ready. And the way you do that, the way you cultivate that culture, is to co-create the change with the people you're asking to change. So rather than imposing change, you co-create the change with the folks who are expected to adopt it. And that is how, like, doing that consistently, that's not a one and done, for a project. Like, that is, if you consistently approach your changes by co-creating, like, that, what that looks like with the people who are expected to change, you naturally create that culture where people are like, oh, like, this is just part of it. Like the old guys you were just talking about. Like, this is just part of how we work. There are these changes every so often, and then we just fold them into the way that we work. So it's really about, rather than about rolling out a change, rather than about the checklist of, checking off we've done the communications, we've done the training, we've done the, rather than that approach, the process approach, this is really about cultivating a culture that is open to change.
So what are some things that you would recommend? Like you've already talked about one, which I think is an example of what you just described, which is when you're making change, you're going to advocate for soliciting feedback from people before the change even begins. You're going to identify those early adopters, solicit feedback. You're going to iterate on that a few times to make sure you have a good, well rounded view of that. What are some of the next steps that you would advise that we should all be taking after that? So now we're going down the path. Maybe we started to pilot with some of those early adopters. What do we do after that to then support that culture of transformation?
So you continue to involve your early adopters. They kind of become like an extension of your change team. They're on the front lines, they're doing it, they're demonstrating to their peers that they're doing it. they can be then pulled into leadership roles themselves. So, as long as they're comfortable with it and they're willing to be like a buddy for somebody who is having a harder time with it, or however that works, like whatever that looks like in your organization, it's not a cookie cutter thing from organization to organization, from team to team, but like bringing them into a kind of leadership role and making sure that like they are being recognized, they for the work that they're doing, like their success stories are being shared, like, and it can be just in this format here, like in a podcast format, where it's just an audio conversation where they talk about what they've learned or what they've gained, or the value that they see, the value they see themselves providing in this new reality, whatever the case may be, depending on what you need to get out into the rest of the workforce, really involving those folks and making sure that their stories are being amplified, and they have the opportunity to lead.
Yeah, I think are you suggesting that their roles would actually change? So the early adopters might actually take on a role, or are you just saying leader from a positioning standpoint as an informal role, a leader of change within their formal job description? Okay.
Yeah, the latter, more informal.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so are there incentives other than recognition that would make sense in a circumstance like what you just described?
My response to that would be ask the people. Right? So, I mean, ask them, like, is there anything that would incentivize them?
Have you heard of any examples along those lines?
Um, generally people don't say they want a pen, or they don't say they want a t-shirt, you know? Even though we love having t-shirts with our initiatives on them,
Yeah.
Like,
That's
typically
actually that's really funny, and I can imagine you've never gotten that back on a survey. We would love to have a drawer full of pens with our company logo on it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, so you definitely can be surprised by the things that come back for that. I mean, sometimes, a healthy competition, that people are motivated by competition. So maybe that, or sometimes people enjoy like getting the badge, kind of walking through a process and earning their badges,
Yep.
being able to show, on social media or whatever the case may be, like the things that they're learning, ways that they're growing. But I mean, really, you just ask. You just ask. Maybe it's a financial incentive. Maybe it's a gift card, where the team that adopts it first gets to go out to a meal together. But instead of like going off in a cave and coming up with ideas of how we might incentivize people and then rolling that out, I just recommend asking people.
You make it sound like that's actually easier than trying to concoct things on our own.
I mean, it may take more time, right? Like, it may take more time, but you're gonna put your money in a more valuable place, right? So rather than spending money on those pens, maybe this is a gift certificate or an Amazon gift card, whatever the case may be, right? Like, you're gonna put the money where it's actually gonna be valuable to the
Have
people.
you ever have you ever seen a scenario where you got some feedback that maybe it wasn't something that you were able to or willing to do or didn't think it was a good idea? So if somebody said, "Hey, you know what? I'd be happy to help you out with this. You know, what would make me feel better is if you gave me at least me a Ferrari for 6 months." Right? That's
Yeah.
what would make me feel better, right? Like
Or
I'm being
never.
silly with the example, but
Yeah, but yeah,
have you ever
never.
yeah,
Nobody has ever come back with anything that was, like, crazy.
outrageous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Isn't
I
that
mean, and
interesting?
that's like, they may surprise you. I mean, they probably will surprise you. The way that the old guys surprised you, right? Like, the things that we assume we know, like, just throw those out the window and ask.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's actually I'm glad that I asked that, and I'm glad to hear your answer. Um, because it doesn't really surprise me at all. And I think most people, especially those that fit the profile that you described before, they're curious, they're ambitious, they're really thinking and they're wanting to be a team player. they're probably not going to come back with something outrageous that's going to be hard to comply with. So for you to, comply with essentially. So I love also talking about the reward mechanisms. We've been talking a lot about this on my team as it relates to our product at Skillful. And I'm curious to get your take on this. Basically, the idea of gamification of some sort. So you talked about badges, you talked about social media posts, right? And we, I realize that I am not as knowledgeable as I'd like to be. I'm not a gamer,
Me.
and so I'm not a great observer of some of those reward mechanisms that other people may favor. I do like recognition. I know some of the things about my psychology. I do like recognition when I accomplish hard things, and so that feels good to me. But I'd be curious if you've like just what are some of the other examples? I'd like to just you already talked about some of these with the badges, but like what do those badges look like? Is that something that goes on their email signature? Is it something that goes in their team's profile pic? What are some of the ways that we can actually implement that if we said badging and some sort of gamification is key to that incentive program?
I'm really not a good person to ask that because I also am not a gamer and I don't like any of that stuff personally.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm not motivated by badges or games personally, but if there are people out there in your population that you want to change who like those things, then you go for it. Me
yeah.
personally, I don't like those things. I prefer like one-on-one connection with people and that recognition that you're talking about, kind of like unexpected recognition.
Why unexpected?
Well, if you expect it, it's less, you don't get that dopamine like loop as much, right? When you come to expect it. So if it happens on like every Friday, the rewards come out. It doesn't get that same kind of boost in the brain. But if it happens unexpectedly, it's this like pleasant surprise, that someone took the time to do that thing for you and it wasn't a planned thing. That seems to have like more of a boost in the brain when it's unexpected,
Okay,
when it's
this is
personal.
actually really really interesting because as I listen to you describe that, it makes perfect sense, and yet I've never really thought about the pros and cons of it being more of a prescribed framework. For example, maybe saying on every monthly all hands call, we're going to recognize this thing. And then this month, Marin receives the award, and next month, Justin receives the award. And that maybe is less impactful than not having such a rigid cadence and catching people off guard. And I'm sure there's some terminology to describe these differences, but that's actually really pretty interesting because I think part of gamification actually is knowing that there is some achievement designation out ahead of these actions. And I would say, again, I'm just, this is an N of one, just one example here. I'm not as like into publicizing those day to day achievements. I like them for my own tracking. I'm really into consistency, or maybe I sometimes struggle with consistency. So I like to track the consistency. That is a reward mechanism for me. So in my little workout app and in my remember to check my blood pressure app, like I like to see all those little squares light up green and show me that I've been consistent on that. I don't ever share that with anybody other than just telling you on this podcast. But I'm not going to like post that to my Facebook or my LinkedIn profile to say, hey, I, check my blood pressure 7 days in a row. But that is very motivating to me. So that's a form of gamification in this app that is very me focused. It's private.
Yeah.
And then there's other forms where people receive badges and then there's a button to post it to social. Right. And so those are two very different mechanisms that as we're talking this through, I realize I could probably have an entire podcast series just talking about this from a psychology standpoint. But it's kind of fascinating, and I'm realizing how little I actually know about the pros and cons of these different approaches.
I love hearing you talk about what motivates you, like seeing that progress, whether anybody else knows about it or not. Because, like, that's one of those things that could easily be true of any group of people that you're asking to change. And that is that's so insightful, right? Because then you can design a system that gives them feedback, but they don't have to share it with anybody else, right?
Right.
Like, this is so brilliant when you ask people and you listen, you can, like, really come up with these very creative ideas that are really gonna connect and resonate with people.
Circling us all the way back around to some earlier things that you talked about, but it does make me wonder then when you go to the early adopters and you're soliciting feedback, you might get feedback in different areas. So let's talk about like just to connect the dots. We solicit feedback and we say, hey, what types of incentives would be important for you? And half the population, just making this easy for us, but let's say half the population says, oh, yes, the recognition idea that you suggested is one of the drop downs. That's hugely important to me. I want my peers and leaders around me to know that I'm contributing to this. And so getting badges and stuff like that that I can share on social or share on our company intranet and stuff like that, that would actually be meaningful to me. The other 50% of the people are saying, I'd like some tracking mechanism, but they're more the Justin style of gamification, which is just, I'm okay kind of keeping that to myself, for my own tracking, but that still feels good to me to reinforce my behavior. How do we then go about implementing that when half the population wants it one way and half the population wants it another way?
You do both.
Okay. Talk me through that a little bit more. Because again, if we're talking 10 people, I have a relatively small company. There's 20 of us now. I can do things 10 and 10. I could do things 5, 5, 5, and 5. But when you're talking about 10,000 or 20,000 or 40,000 people around the world, like it's a little bit harder to divvy those things up.
I mean, I think in those 2 examples, so everything is very, like, um, example specific, right? So, it's really not cookie cutter. But in your
Mhm.
2 examples, the folks opt in to their preference at the beginning, right? There's 2 tracks they can follow. They opt into the one that is most meaningful to them, and they follow that.
What has caused you, or what is it about you that makes you so focused on the people feedback? Have there been, is it just part of who you are as a person? Is this a professional skill and awareness that you developed maybe through some, just through your career journey? I'm just, it seems like it's something that's so deep in how you think that I'd just love to get inside your head a little bit to figure out how that came about.
That is a very deep question.
It
I
is a deep question. It's intended to be. I'd really like to understand it more because it's such a strong. It's not like it's just like some checkbox thing that you like read in a, saw in a webinar at work and decided to implement it. Right? This
Yeah.
is deeper than for you.
Yeah. How deep you wanna go? Into my childhood?
I'm going to leave it wide open for you.
Yeah. Gosh, this is not a question that I had notes,
I didn't
prepared.
have it on my list.
Yeah, it was not on your list, but it's certainly worth asking. Um, I mean, it probably goes back to childhood somehow for me, just, like, experiences in my, family dynamic and, um, how that produced me as an adult and what it made matter to me as an adult. I, was the 3rd kid. I wasn't planned, and, like, I always got the middle seat. I was the chair at the end of the booth, like the add-on, whatever. Like, it wasn't, like, part of the original plan. So probably there's some psychology behind that I, have dedicated my academic and professional life to, giving people a voice, uh, including people in the process, including people in decision making, bringing clarity, bringing connection and community, like, all of that, I'm sure is in response to some things that happened to me was when I was growing up. But also seeing it work, so for the last 7 or 8 years that I've been doing this, like, change focused work, the more that I do this, like, put the human at the center, involve them in the process from the beginning to the end, like, shape my work around their reality. the more that I do that, the more I see it succeed. Like, the more people open up and there like, there's warmth and there's connection and there's possibility, and just, like, very positive relationships with the people that I work with who are, who I'm asking to do these things, I'm asking to change, like, we are building rapport by doing this work together. So the more I see it succeed, the more convinced I am that it's the right thing to do, even if it traces back to my own personal roots and my own intuition, right? Like the
Well, I think
data backing it up, the more I do it.
I appreciate you sharing that, even though it wasn't on our list of questions. No, I think it is important. And I think all of our backgrounds, all of our past experiences, the wisdom that we've developed, um, you know, affects how we act as professionals, obviously. And so I think your story is a good example of that. And I think it creates this interesting situation, as we've often talked about around change management, is that digital transformation initiatives, which I hate that expression, by the way, but I find myself using it because it seems to have become kind of common speak. But digital transformation sounds like it's all about the digital, and it's actually not at all about the digital. Like, um, it's the digital part is at some foundational level there, sure, but the real challenge, the real outcomes, the benefits, all of that really is more about the people side of things. And so you're bringing a very real, actually common sense, right? Not to dismiss the approach, but it actually just makes a lot of sense to say, instead of trying to make a bunch of silly stuff up and seeing what sticks, we should probably just talk to the humans a little bit more. Right? Can you think of any negative consequences of opening the floodgates and maybe getting something that you really wish you hadn't gotten, or maybe some downsides that you have to deal with?
I mean, this does take longer up front, right? This approach, like you have to be prepared to spend more time building out your plan up front because you're gathering information from a lot of sources, you're distilling that information, you're reflecting it back, you're validating it, you're changing it, right? So it does take more time up front. Um, and there was another thing I thought of that I have now forgotten. But another, it's too close. But yes, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to distract you, but I'll free you to think for that for a minute. And I know I have an example that's come to my mind as I was thinking about the way you were talking about the planning and the upfront effort to go into soliciting feedback. And I could think of an example where I've made mistakes, and it was about how we framed the request. We blew it.
Hmm.
We ended up with bad outcomes from the feedback, but it wasn't necessarily because of the people. It was because of how we framed what we were asking for. I don't think we did a good enough job. We knew what we meant,
Hmm.
but they didn't know what we meant. And
Hmm.
that's on us. I always say it's up to the communicator, not the communicatee, to understand the message. And that was up to us. We blew it in how we communicated. And so we ended up getting a lot of feedback that was the wrong type of feedback, the wrong volume of feedback, the wrong expectations about the feedback. Like, everything was wrong. And when I really reflected on that, I think there were a lot of things that we could have done differently to put that in better position. And so I think when I think about you talking about the planning, just all the time that goes in up front, that's part of it, is making sure that it's not just about asking for feedback, but it's about communicating why you're asking for it, and what the downstream is all going to lead to.
Hmm. Yes, good point. And let me spit this out before I forget it again. But um, folks may not have an answer, so that's another potential downside that you ask them what they need to be successful, and they may not know.
Yeah.
But that isn't a showstopper. That doesn't mean that you discard them and you go off in your cave and you go back to the way of doing it that you always did, right? So that means that you have to continue to come up with ideas for how to do it, but you have to keep vetting them with that person, right? So they don't have their own ideas. You still bring them things to consider. Bring them half baked. Don't bring them a fully baked thing and say, "Did I get it right?" Right? But like say, "Okay, so you weren't sure what you needed when I asked you before, but you gave me, this feedback and this feedback and this feedback. So based on that, what about this? Would something like this work for you?" And then you get their feedback that way. So they may not have the answer right away. And it may take this, I mean, still it's this time thing, right? This upfront, taking the extra time. Um, but that's another potential downside is that they don't actually, they don't tell you they need, and you still have to pull it out of them, right?
Yeah. There have been a lot of very innovative people that, people, names that we know, Steve Jobs, Henry Ford, people like that, the old statement. I can't prove that he actually said this, but it's often attributed to him that if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And so sometimes we have to take some initiative to implement some ideas. But I think to your point, what you're saying is in agreement with that to say, yes, if they don't have anything, maybe a blank slate is a little bit too overwhelming for certain people to say, I don't have just fresh ideas. But if you gave me 3 or 4 things to choose between and we could iterate on that a little bit, it would be clear to me, even what's important to me. And I think that speaks to the planning that's required on the front end to be able to position that well and really get the best feedback and best engagement that you can. I think that this is something as I'm thinking this through the year, it seems like it's easier said than done. This does require quite a bit of thought, strategy, literal experimentation. And I think it goes back to something we talked about before, which is the culture piece, right? Because you'll probably mess up a couple of times. You probably won't be as flawless as you wish that you were in how you approach this. But if you've built a culture of trust and as you talked about, just like preparing the workforce for change in the way that you did, then hopefully they'll give you a little bit of flexibility to say, hey, we came back with some ideas based on your feedback last time. We have some new things that we want to run by you, right? And make that a little bit of an iterative process.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's almost good to not be perfect out of the gate,
Yeah.
because like it gives them the opportunity to shape it. Mm.
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting statement because I think a lot of project teams, in fact, I would say the higher the stakes, the more perfection seems to be the aspirational goal. I could think about a project very near and dear to us right now that is massive and the expectations were very, very, very high and things did not go according to plan on the first go around. And they're reeling from that a little bit right now as a result of that. And and it's because the stakes were so very high. There was so much attention paid on the front end, but there was very little room for iteration in the early phases of this. I think there was an expectation that we've spent so much time on this that this first phase has got to be stellar. And it wasn't. And instead of that being expected, it became a major setback. So I think that's actually something pretty interesting that maybe the difference isn't even necessarily just how we execute, but how we set expectations about how we execute, especially in the early phases when, we're making first impressions on what this transformation is going to be like. And if we set the expectation that, hey, we're coming out of the gate hard, we're going to be at 100% in the first 60 days, and then we come in at 90, that seems like it's a failure. When in reality, most projects like that would have been at 70% or whatever the numbers are, right? We actually did pretty well, but we've now positioned it as a setback. Okay. We have gone long as I knew that we would. And I have a whole bunch of other questions that I want to ask you that we're not going to have time for. So I am going to ask you one more question and just is there a single idea or kind of words of wisdom, that piece of advice that you would share with our listeners about? I think I know one of your answers, but it has to be something other than ask the people. But a
So
piece of
that can't
advice
be
that
part of my answer?
all right, it can be part of it. Actually, it's your answer. You get to choose however you want. So if you want that to be your answer, that is just fine.
Okay, this
But
is
I'd be
the
curious kind of what words of wisdom you'd leave us with in terms of dealing with change, especially change at scale, the way that you're handling it today.
yeah. So my this is one of the questions that we talked about beforehand. So I do have an answer prepared for this one. But before I give my prepared answer, I want to just talk about this progress over perfection discussion that we just had.
Okay.
So like that can be part of my parting advice, I suppose, is to like be human yourself, right? So like yes, you want to treat your users as humans, treat your workers as humans and involve them in the process, but you're human too with flaws and like allow that to be part of the experience. Like you don't have to be perfect. It can be progress over perfection for everyone involved, right? Like then you're all in the trenches together rather than somebody imposing on somebody else. So maybe that's my impromptu advice that I would say. But my sort of bottom line that I had planned as my answer for this question, which is kind of just a summary of like my approach on all this stuff, is that before you build a plan, build your own understanding. So that is, ask people what they need to be successful with the change, and then shape your work around their reality. And that is how you build that culture where people are open to change. And that's because it's change that is co-created and not imposed. So
I
that's
think
my sort of like
we should call
that's my
this episode.
philosophical. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And you're reminding me, of course, of Stephen Covey, who said, seek first to understand
Mm.
and to be understood as one of his 7 habits. And so I think that's great. We need to do that first. We need to understand first what's important to them, what's going on in their minds, and then only after we've done that successfully can we then expect to convey the things that are on our mind and explain what we need to happen in the organization. So that's awesome. Thank you so very much for taking the time today. I feel like this is maybe we just need to go to a longer format because I'm 7 minutes over our already long format here. And so maybe we just need to go to a longer format. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate you sharing. Um, for those that don't know, Marin is also a host of a podcast as well. And this is her first time coming on as a guest of a podcast. And I think she did excellently. So thank you very much for being here today. And a little bit of role reversal, but thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Justin. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Frontline Innovators. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And remember, when we put people at the center of digital transformation, frontline workers thrive and organizations succeed. This podcast is brought to you by Skillful, helping frontline teams adopt the technology they need to work smarter, safer, and with confidence.